Good evening and welcome to Melbourne Town Hall. I'm Michael Williams, Director of the Wheeler Centre, and it's very thrilling to be back here again. I like the smattering of applause over there too. It's always good to know where your family is. Great to know where your family is. It's hard to believe this is the fourth time we've stood up here in Melbourne Town Hall and launched a year of Wheeler Centre programming into the world. We wouldn't be here at all, obviously, if it weren't for the vision, the generosity and the ongoing support of the State Government of Victoria. Our thanks to Premier and Minister for the Arts, Ted Baillieu, and to everyone at Arts Victoria. I think Arts Victoria is celebrating a 40th birthday this year and is showing no indications of a midlife crisis, so that's handy, obviously. Their support is invaluable. And it really feels like such an amazing opportunity we're being given. I'm personally incredibly proud of what that investment has managed to bring to the cultural and intellectual life of this city. In Tony and Maureen Wheeler, we have found benefactors, supporters, friends, and my thanks goes out to them. My thanks also to Jenny Niven. Tonight is the brainchild of our extraordinary Associate Director and Head of Programming. So a big thank you to Jenny for putting tonight together. Thank you also to the tireless Wheeler Centre team, without whom the weeks and months of Wheeler Centre programming stretching ahead of us would not be happening. Pauline, Shannon, Tam, John, Joe, Jennifer, Catherine, Sarah, Vicky, Oren, Catherine, Fiona, Donica, Lucy and Gemma. What a team. Give them a round of applause, please. That applause was especially important because they won't be being paid this year. So I'm hoping that they put that away and really enjoy it over time. Thank you also to Eric Beecher, our chair, and to the rest of our marvellous board. The ambition and imagination that our board bring to this organisation is a fundamental part of what drives us on and keeps us excited and keeps us pushing to ever be better and bring more to the Melbourne landscape. Thank you to The Age and the Sofitel, our major sponsors, and to everyone else who supports us through the year. But thank you also to the Wurundjeri people. We stand on their land. Most of our events take place on Wurundjeri land, and I'd ask you to join me in welcoming Auntie Joy Murphy.
Thanks very much, Michael. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight, and could I just say that I'm really very excited and a bit nervous, but I do want to thank the Wheeler Centre for the special invite and everyone that's been involved in getting this together, and to you. I'm going to do a little bit of something different. I thought I'd take the opportunity to be a part of Max and go on a little magical tour myself, and then I'll introduce Welcome to Country. Yaran Dinjung, which means barefoot. Barefoot and pregnant is an old saying. Bare as a baby's beautiful bum is still said today. A foot, 12 inches, was once the measurement of a ruler, at least in my time. Long before another human race came to this land, all living beings walked barefoot, in tune with the land and the environment. Big animals, small animals, birds, and all creatures were given appropriate, suitable feet. Indeed, the first peoples of lands and on this land walked barefoot for thousands of years, adapting to all conditions, weather and the like. No such things as calluses or blisters or corns, because on their feet was no adorn of leather, vinyl, plastic or other. They walked 1,000,000 miles over thousands of years. Yaran Dijung. They lived by the law of the land and they travelled far and wide. Yaran Dijung. Every meal was planned with each step taken. Yaran Dijung. Every baby born by a mother who was Yaran Dijung. Every child that lived survived. Yaran Dijung. All the animals bounded and chased. Yaran Dijung. And all the creatures crawled and slithered. Yaran Dijung. Now I walk on this ancient land. I feel the hurt and the sadness beneath the soles of my feet. I feel like I am standing on broken glass and I can see the blood running through my veins. Drip, 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 then whoosh. I feel sad. My tears fall one by one on my Yaran Dijan. I can taste the sweetness of each tear, but the pain rolls through my head, tears my heart, rips through my guts. I can't stand this anymore, so I fall down into the sea of darkness. I hear a voice. Come on, girl, stand up and stand tall. Yaran Dijan. Keep walking and tell the world how proud you are to walk Yaran Dijan on your father's country in the Dijan Konji's footprints of your ancestors. All right, my father, I'll walk this country and I'll take each step with great pride. And my children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren will walk with me. But I'll invite others to join us for our imprints to walk the same journey, Yaran Dijan. And along the way, I'll offer a eucalyptus leaf, our custom of welcome, and I'll ask them to accept it, and I'll tell them, you now join with us to pay your respects and honour the spirits of our ancestors who have nurtured this land for thousands of years. You are welcome to everything, from the tops of the trees to the roots of the earth. We ask you to help us to replenish and protect Mother Earth for all time. My language is the Woiwurrung, Wominjaka, Wurundjeri Balak, Yemen, Kundibik, and you are most welcome to the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. Thank you.
Thank you, Auntie Joy. This is the last time you'll see me tonight, so I don't have that sense of dread that I'm going to keep popping back up. One of the really important things to us about acknowledging country properly tonight was around that idea of stories and shared stories and remembered stories, and the importance of not living in a creative and imaginative state of terra nullius, assuming that we're the first people to be getting on a stage telling a story or to be thinking about these things. And one of the things that's exciting for us when approaching what we do at the Wheeler Centre is trying to tap into the conversations that have happened before and to find ways to build on them and add to them. And they may be Indigenous stories, they may be the stories of an American writer writing 50 years ago a children's book that had an impact that could only be imagined at the time. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another, his mother called him Wild Thing. And Max said, "I'll eat you up." So he was sent to bed without eating anything. That very night in Max's room, a forest grew and grew and grew until his ceiling hung with vines and the walls became the world around. Tonight isn't a tribute night to Maurice Sendak. It's a night that aims to be inspired by his work, by his belief in the power of the imagination and his belief in the need for us to all go a little bit wild. You're going to hear from some extraordinary, very different writers. And at the end, I would like a wild rumpus. So I'm going to be listening for that. But could you please join me in making welcome the first speaker, Arnold Zabel.
Like Maurice Sendak, I was a child of, well, why give it away in the first line? Few self-respecting storytellers would do that, and Sendak was a master storyteller. He knew his task was to tell the story and let others make of it what they will. So, once upon a time, circa 1960, give or take a year or two, about the same time, more or less, that Maurice Sendak wrote Where the Wild Things Are, I lived in the suburb of Carlton. Like many boys on the block, I had a lot of freedom, since my parents were making a new life in a new world. Before the war, Father was a Yiddish poet. Here, a Yiddish poet could earn maximum 1 cent a year for his vocation. Instead, he worked in factories, and finally graduated to a stall in the Vic Market. He sold socks and stockings, seconds they were called, which he bought from the hosiery mills of Brunswick. I also worked on the Vic Market, but not for my father. He never paid me. I worked for Sean Ferguson instead. Sean sold nuts. Walnuts, almonds, peanuts, you name it, he sold it. And he had two states of drunkenness, happy drunk and sad drunk. Sad drunk, he would slip under the counter and say, "Arnold, you look after the business." Happy drunk, he once put his arms around me and said, "Arnold, you too can become a professional nutter." He was a prophet. I digress. On the streets of Carlton, we became wild things. We climbed the rooftops to drop into the houses of neighbouring friends. I ran messages from the corner pub to the back lane SB bookies for $1 a run. We played a game at the cemetery called Walking on Air. The aim was to get from one side to the other without touching the ground, also known as grave hopping. And there were wilder things who roamed the streets. The gang who would grab me, push my head into the median strip and demand, kiss the ground and say, "I killed Jesus." There was the drunk who would hang out by the post office and offer a quid to suck him off. He was easily outrun, unlike the boy who terrorised us and once chased me down the back lane, knife in hand. He was finally put away for stabbing his mother. I learned to handle these threats in the classical way. Flight or fight. If the wild thing was greater in size, it was flight. If smaller or about the same size, I would give fight a go, especially after I began receiving boxing instructions in a gym located in a backlane stable off Fenwick Street. But once through the door of the house, I entered another world. Mother, with the gypsy black eyes, had performed as a singer in the Polish city of Białystok before the war. She was now confined to singing Yiddish songs while she sat at the sewing machine late into the night doing piecework for nearby factories. Father would be bent over the books of his beloved Yiddish poets at the dresser, his makeshift table in the front room. But there was a darker side to the house. It was peopled with ghosts. It hinted at wild, barbaric deeds. I would look at photos in fraying albums and ask, "Who are these people?" 3 of my 6 sisters, my mother replied. 1 of my 3 brothers, your uncle Joshua, your cousins Frida and Chaimke, your grandmother, Hannah Esther. "Where are they now?" I asked. "I don't want to talk about it," she retorted. The anger was always imminent, about to break out. Mother was a woman prone to rages and tirades. She fought with father. The arguments always took place in the kitchen, the motor room of the house. There were saving graces, mind you. My parents would argue in Yiddish, a language rich in curses. Mother leading off. "May an umbrella go into your stomach and open up." Father, in reply, "May you lose all your teeth, but one tooth should remain so you can have a toothache." And mother, always the final word. "May your feet be made of wood, your stomach contain water, and your head be made of glass, so when your feet catch fire, your stomach will boil and your head will explode, and your eyes pop out." When the arguments flared, I would run between my parents trying to keep the peace. Instead, I would be drawn into the fray and become enraged. I once shattered the kitchen window to halt the madness, to no avail. And one day, I was perhaps 12, 13 at the time, I thought, I don't have to be part of this. I made my way from the kitchen where the tirade was in full flight to the bedroom, closed the door, and for some reason, I began to write. I can't recall what I wrote, but I do recall the pen racing across the page, trying to keep up with my thoughts and emotions. And then an extraordinary thing happened. When I entered the room, I felt heavy, but when I left, I felt light. I could hear their angry voices in the kitchen, but they no longer got to me. I had discovered the meaning of expression. Ex is a prefix meaning out, hence expression meaning getting it out. In time, I discovered something else. My writing would begin in confusion, but in the process somehow things would fall into place. It was a means of creating order out of chaos. It would begin with the need to get it out, and it would lead to working it out. I also began to understand reasons for my mother's rages. She remained silent about her family's fate, but she would awaken from a recurring dream crying, "Mama, Mama." One night, I crept down the passage and I heard her tell Father she'd had that dream again, and her village was on fire and she was running from the flames with her brothers and sisters, and one by one they fell until she was the last one left running. Father was the sole survivor of a large extended family, and Mother one of just 3 sisters who survived. An entire link in the ancestral chain had been wiped out. Now I can finally say that, like Maurice Sendak, I was the child of Polish Jewish immigrants whose extended families were destroyed in what became known as the Shoah, the annihilation. Like Sendak, I was deeply troubled by the many deaths in my family. Like Sendak and his protagonist Max, I had to find a way to deal with the anger that stalked my childhood. And like Sendak, it was the imagination and the art of story that came to my rescue. Yet, as in many once upon a time stories, this tale does have a hopeful ending. Despite it all, Mother never failed to nurse her 3 children through the illnesses that afflicted them throughout their childhood. She never failed to keep the house in order and make sure there was food on the table. I hear her calling us as evening falls. Her voice reaches out from afar, from the veranda of our single-fronted terrace on Canning Street to the median strip where we are playing football, as we do on many nights. And when we are finally drawn inside, dinner is waiting, and it is hot. Thank you.
My sister has had sex with 66 men. She counted up one night in the musty hotel room in Istanbul. We had a twin share in the Alibaba Hotel. I was riveted. David Dingley? Your first time was with David Dingley? Who else? I didn't know any of the others, not one. She lives in Brighton. Brighton, it seems, is foaming with carnality. Recently, a friend was looking for real estate in Brighton. There was a cul-de-sac where 4 houses were for sale, all at once. "What's the story here?" she asked the real estate agent. "Why is every house on the market?" He lowered his voice. They were all having affairs with each other. Got messy. In Brighton. Home of the NIMBY, not in my backyard. How wrong can you be? My sister and I have different social networks. I work in a bank. She works in hospitality. Clearly, over the years, she's been very hospitable. I'm not judgmental about sex. I have a simple philosophy. If more people had more sex more often, we'd all be happier. I know 66 sounds quite a lot, but if you average it out over a 20-year period, it's only 3 or 4 a year. So in fact, she has been quite abstemious. Nevertheless, I can't tell my older sister. She's been married to the same man since the Boer War. She doesn't approve of people with appetites. 2 months after we got back from Turkey, my little sister, the wild thing, meets a business development manager and marries him. They sell Brighton and they buy a fake Tudor house with pencil pines out the front in Balwyn. And then they have a son, Max. Max, it must be said, is a very unusual child. My sister thinks he's gifted. Most parents in Balwyn have gifted children. Once, I took Max to playgroup and I noticed amongst the gifted there was an astonishing number of allergies. Presumably the downside of living in Balwyn. One small boy had a sticker on his lunchbox, "No kiwi fruit." I said to the mother, what happens if he eats kiwi fruit? She sighed. He goes right off. Max has special friends that live in his bedroom. They are wild animals. My sister and her husband have to set a place at the table for Fing. He is large and ferocious and invisible, and he will not eat vegetables. If Fing won't, then Max won't. On his 7th birthday, I give Max a wolf suit. I assume that he will chuck it over his shoulder, as he does with most of my lovingly selected gifts. But to my amazement, Max puts it on and he won't take it off. His father, the business development manager, laughs. "You've created a monster." My older sister arches one eyebrow. Max was born a monster. He is not a sheep in wolf's clothing. He is a wolf who has finally found his skin. My older sister has 2 daughters. They are slim and polite and make their own beds. By comparison, Max is a terrorist. When I arrived, he was out on the decking, carefully dropping knives and forks through the slats, where they vanished into a parallel dimension. That's why we're all eating with plastic knives and forks. Now he is vacuuming up the cashews from the bowls on the coffee table. He's scooping up great handfuls of pretzels. I rescue one of the bowls. "Hold on a cotton-picking minute," I say. He marches out of the lounge and into the dining room, and when he returns, he's carrying a little case with texters. His mother says, "Don't draw on the sofa, Max." She walks into the kitchen. Max draws on the sofa. She returns. "Max, did you hear me?" He nods. "Why did you draw on the sofa when I specifically asked you not to, Max?" "Did you want to make Mummy angry? Is that why you did it?" Did you want to get into trouble, did you? My sister takes a deep breath. She walks out. She doesn't want to get so angry that he will feel unloved and end up in a juvenile detention centre. Suddenly, she shrieks, "Max!" We rush into the dining room. There on the carpet by the fireplace is a perfectly shaped log of poo. Max is 7. That's it, young man. My sister drags her son off by the wolf collar and hurls him into his room and slams the door.
Everyone has a love that they lost in the woods. Listen to Guthrie. Listen to Leadbelly. A person might spend their whole life trying to get back to that place, scrabbling through the muddy underbrush to find what they once had, what has long since been swallowed up by the story. We went out there at the end of July, snow piled up at the side of the road and the lake water cold as a lost child. Winter had thinned out the ranks of hikers, and the passenger ferry made fewer circuits around the lake. Some days it didn't go by at all. Winter was better, she said. We took enough supplies for 8 days. I carried our sleeping bag and all the food, the camping stove and fuel. Yannicka carried the crypto kit, a medium format camera with telephoto lens, bottles of developer and fixer, a Patterson tank, I don't know how many rolls of high-speed film, and a crude hydrophone she'd copied from a DIY instructional, effectively a tiny microphone tucked into a red balloon, attached to a cheap set of earphones. "You did remember the monster bait?" I asked. She ignored me, snapping at the red balloon. "Do you think this thing will work?" she said. I said it was as good as anything else, but what I meant was that it didn't matter if she'd wrangled a hydrophone from the Swedish Navy. I was sure there'd be no way to capture the thing, no medium that existed to fix it in place. It was possible that there had once been something, the last Antipodean plesiosaur, descended of whatever was trapped there in the last glaciation, sparking wonderful terror as it paddled, lonely and oblivious, around the marrow-shaped lake. There hadn't been a sighting for half a century, but Yannicka was undeterrable. This had started long before I met her. She still had the faint semicircular scar on her thigh, a series of pinpricks that matched the rows of tiny sandpaper teeth of a 7-foot catfish. Now, if you've got a monster like that, skulking around Lake Schlackensee, she told me, in a pissy 8.5 meters of water, imagine what you've got down in Lake St. Clair in 200. The Schlackensee fish had been no big ordeal. It hadn't dragged her below the surface to gulp lungfuls of the tannin-coloured water. It hadn't even bit her all that hard. It had just closed its wide, toothy mouth around her leg and knew right away that she wasn't what it wanted. She kicked out and her foot met with the immense thing's slimy underbelly, and she'd swum to the muddy shore before she could make sense of it. Someone threw a blanket around her shoulders, and she was already joking by then. I guess I just wasn't his type. But this was something else. Now at Lake St. Clair, she became crepuscular, shouldering her camera and going down to the lakeside in the twilight, returning to the hut after dark, then slipping off again before dawn. If the monster had any nous, and she was sure it must have some, there was no way it was coming up to feed during the daylight hours. That was just pure thylacine stupidity. During the day, it was going to stay way down where no one could get at it, bury itself in the black Triassic silt, which was as fine as smoke, and when it died, that's where its bones would lay. I followed Yannicka along the lakeside a couple of times, but mostly I stayed in, feeding logs to the ancient stove. I got it so warm in that place that all of the flies that had been lying dormant over the colder months suddenly woke up, fooled into an artificial summer. I felt powerful, I was dependable. I was the little yellow light through the trees that Yenica could look up and find if she felt frightened out there in the darkness. On the 5th day, the sky opened up, but she went out into the deluge anyway, everything swaddled in plastic. She stayed away late. I left her dinner of rice and beans congealing in the metal food safe, where the rats and possums couldn't scavenge it, and I went to bed. A while later, I heard the door open, a succession of wet thuds as her sodden clothes hit the floor, and she crawled into the bunk beside me, shaking. I rubbed my hands over her back, trying to get rid of the chill. I was so drenched, she said. I thought I might as well just get in the water. Well, I said, that was clever. Well, I wasn't getting any wetter. I thought if I stayed under a while, I might be able to hear something. And did you? What happened to your hydro thing? Oh God, that was useless. Did I hear something? I don't know. It was still loud under there with all the rain, like white noise. But I swear, you could feel it. I woke several hours later to the grainy dawn coming in through the high windows. Yenica had been out already and was now clattering round the hut at gale force, measuring chemicals by torchlight, heating lake water on the camping stove. I watched sleepily as she set the film into the developing tank, her arms buried deep in a light-proof bag. Her hands moved so fast it was as though she had some small, frantic creature trapped in there. So, I said. You'll see, she said, pulling her arms free of the bag. She adjusted the temperatures, went through the cycle of chemicals, finally pouring the dilutions from the tank back into the bottles. She took the spools from the tank and spiraled off the wet film. There, she said, there, look. A single exposure in a long black strip. It wasn't much bigger than a matchbook. I took it out into the brittle winter light and held it up to see. Oh, I said. It occurred to me then that it wouldn't have mattered what I saw. A dark shape moving under the water, a small hump rising out of it like an upturned boat. It wouldn't have mattered if I saw nothing at all. Things were still going to go the way they were going to go. The exposed frame was like a tiny window, and I looked through it to the water, the lake a blind mirror and all the birds lifting off from it at once, shattering the sky. Tomorrow, I'd walk the 3 hours back to Cynthia Bay on my own. Yenica stared at me through the doorway of the hut. Well, she said, tell me what you see.
My oars drip with phosphorescence. Fish surge below me in a flare of light, and stars are fused to the water by their own brilliance. We are all blurred by this pale green blaze and the confusion of elements leaching into each other, a dream of water and midnight. Mullet trail lime gauze as my oars spring spot fires and the boat curves ribbons of green glass in its wake, a molten, ephemeral celebration of our passage. The bow scrapes into the sand of the bank and I pretend to fish, while awed by luminous fish creeping to the bait and then slinking away into the deeper trenches of the river. I remove the prawn to avoid the distraction of dealing with a fish out of water. And the water is so warm, it's hard to know when you slide your hand beside the boat whether you are feeling water or glowing air. A night heron lands beside the boat with a quail of alarm, scandalised by my presence. He stalks away, indignation betrayed by pearls of light dripping from his skulking toes. This is his bank. How dare I invade the sanctuary of his murderous reverie? The nightjar has been calling since an hour after dark, as she has been since the month warmed. That call mesmerised me as a young man, and it took me years to see the maker of the whooping runnel of sound. At last, I saw her by moonlight, and years later, I disturbed her roost in a carpet of fallen leaves from the round leaf box. The pattern of these layered circles of burnt red and jaded green are so reminiscent of my aunt's carpet that I always inspected it thereafter for the faint outline of a reclining bird and the half-opened eye of its defiance. Every summer night I hear that call on the riverbank and spend hours waiting for the irregular return of its haunting as the stars wind down the sky, the plough chasing Pleiades, or rather, the seven sisters fleeing across the sky from the spirit man who would treat them ill. Cormorants have been flying to their roosts in the tree that leans above me. It's been dark for an hour, but they know their way and now jostle and ruffle, settling for the night, a boarding house of coarse boys. They bray like querulous ghosts, and I'm surprised to find myself smiling in the dark. A grown adult smiling at the riot of unruly friends. I reverse from the bank, as fluke is as easy to row backwards as forwards, and I slide across the deeper channel at the bend, 30 foot of black water which skipjacks streak across like firework rockets, nervous of the depth and its denizens. I wait. At last I hear the grumble and bark of Mulloway below me in the river's trench, too deep to allow phosphorescence to reveal the threat of their mass. The calls detonate on the hull like slow thunder. The river listens, the birds stilled by the lazy song of giants. The journey home leaves an emerald boss of hot glass in our wake, a chevron uncoiling from the stern. The blades sweep and plunge, green fire skittering off each lifted blade. Coot and swamp hen keck and cackle in the swamp. A pobblebonk frog gawks and clocks in its partly submerged cave, a marshy liquid talk. The boobook's call is a slow and thoughtful repetition of its name as it blinks and stares, scaring the willies out of swamp rats and ring-tailed possums. The masked owl might not shriek tonight. She is sparing of her terror. And I have no grandfather to tell me if I should avoid her or luxuriate in her awful presence. But I need no grandfather to tell me that I am in love with the river of night and her dreadful conversation.
I write and illustrate children's books, and I'm also Australia's first children's laureate. I've got this honour for 2 years, sharing it with Burri Prior. We're ambassadors for children's literature, literacy and storytelling. We both work with children all over Australia. Burri reckons he has worked with more than 1 million children, and I've seen a lot too. I've worked in posh city schools where everybody who needs glasses or braces has them, and poor schools where a lot of kids are hungry and dirty. From Bruny Island to Mornington Island, I've helped kids turn their stories into books. I love this work. The kids are always fantastic, but it's heartbreaking that so many of them will never reach their potential because of their circumstances. If every child could leave primary school able to read and loving to read, this could change. They would have that gold pass to the world. But that's another story. I meet kids in all sorts of moods, crackling with energy, so excited they can hardly speak, shy, resigned, bored, unimpressed, tired and grumpy. Now and again I witness a no-holds tantrum, and I'm always struck by the power of it, screaming, thrashing about on the floor, going blue in the face, throwing things, doing whatever they can to shout, "It's my life, I want to do it my way." You've got to love that hell-bent desire to have the world the way you want it. My friend Janie once picked her daughter up from a 4-year-old's birthday party and passed another mother carrying her son to the car mid-tantrum. He was as stiff as a starfish and screaming blue murder. When Janie asked Lizzie later why he was so upset, she patiently explained that the birthday mum had cut his sandwiches into triangles and he wanted squares. They do drive you crazy, kids. My lowest point as a parent, which my adult children love reminding me of, was when I threw plums at Will when I couldn't catch him to smack. As he hopped around on the driveway dodging my missile, she shouted out, "You ought to have a look at yourself, you're out of control." And I was. Now I can't imagine getting steamed up enough to want to smack anybody, but those years of little kids were highly geared. I thought that all I would have to do was love them, but it wasn't like that. Being a parent was like trying to run a ship with a crew of bloody-minded ratbags. Nobody took orders. It was all negotiating, cajoling, teaching, explaining, arbitrating and caring, while trying to let them be their own selves too, letting them go to where the wild things are to make their way in the world. Of course we want to protect our children from harm, but it's often the wild things they do that stay with them as adults that leave them feeling powerful. Most kids are like Max and have adventures in their imaginations. For many kids, their version of staring into their yellow eyes without blinking once is camping in the backyard, climbing a big tree or walking down a spooky street. And some kids get up to hair-raising things that their parents often don't learn about for years. When Matthew was 10, he wriggled down a wombat hole to rescue his dog's puppies. So far down, his feet disappeared, his little sister reported. When Kylie and Nathan were 8, they climbed into the cattle grid and lay in the weedy bottom to watch the milk tanker roar over their heads. When my daughter Claire was 5, she got so angry with me that she climbed into the top of her wardrobe and zipped herself into a Puma sports bag. She stayed there for hours until the whole family was calling out for her. It was only when I stood in her room and said in a shaking voice, "Are you here, Claire? Because I'm going to call the police," that a belligerent "no" came muffled from the cupboard. When I was 10, I became a cowgirl. A cattle truck arrived at our farm with some new cows late one night. I was in bed, but I begged Dad to let me go with him to unload them. I put a jumper on over my flannelette pyjamas and pulled my gumboots on. My pony Tammy was in the yard, so I bridled her and hopped on bareback to guide the cows over the road to their paddock, the headlights of the truck lighting the way. Just as they got to the gateway, one of the dogs spooked the mob, and when they took off down the road, my stock pony took off after them. It was so dark I could barely see the cows, but I could hear them snorting and bellowing and crashing through the scrub on the roadside. The bush was too thick to gallop through, so we jumped down onto the gravel road and pelted along that until we got ahead of the mob and turned them for home. By the time Dad arrived in the ute, we were well underway, and Tammy and I, alone and unassisted, brought them home and safely into their paddock. My pyjamas were soaked with the pony's sweat, and my heart was beating like a drum, but I felt like a champion. And when my niece Rachel was 12, she had a midnight adventure too. Her parents wouldn't let her go to a party in Foster, 15 kilometres from the farm. Rachel was a good kid, but she had a determined streak, so on the night of the party, she went to bed early, stuffed clothes in her bed to make a shape resembling a sleeping her, climbed out the window and set off to Foster on her bike. It was a bleak South Gippsland night with the easterly beating in from Bass Strait, and a sliver of moon gave her just enough light to see. She went on the back road where there would be less traffic and didn't see a car. The Black Swamp Road sounds scary, and it is. A lonely road with only a couple of farmhouses set well back and dark gullies and stands of bush to pass through. Rach had almost been vomiting with fear before she set out, but as she pushed along the gravel road, with the inlet glinting silver on her right and the lights of the town shining far ahead, her queasy guts settled and the power in her legs pushing the pedals started to rise up through her body. She felt bigger and stronger, part of the night. The party was a flop. Rach didn't tell anybody how she got there or how she was going home, so nobody knew about the ride. All the talk was about who was doing what with who, school and footy, but Rach didn't take anything in. All she could think about was the ride, being out in the big dark night, being part of it in a way that she was never part of it in a car or a house, when the inside light made the night huge and terrifying. It was incredible that nobody noticed how different she was. Around midnight, she melted out of the room and headed home. The sky was clear now, and the paddocks looked blue in the moonlight. In one dark gully, she startled a kangaroo, and for a while it boinged along the road beside her before peeling off and into the bush. We Are the Champions was running through her head. It had been playing as she left the party, and she began to sing as she rode, alone and in charge of the night. Doof barked once as she reached the house, but shut up as soon as she shushed him. She quietly let herself in the back door and hopped into bed. It was good to be home. Thank you.
I remember my parents once read me a story and bought me a kaleidoscope. The story was about a boy, and the kaleidoscope was one that you could see straight through and use whatever you were facing to make the patterns. So I would take it outside and try and stare at the sun, or point it at a cut on my knee like I was performing some sort of magical surgery. I used to love looking at my parents' faces when they were trying to get me into trouble. They'd turn into confused supernovas, inverted universes of angry eyebrows, my mum's jewellery and my dad's thick Greek moustache cut up into fragments. From then on, life came at me from all angles. Bones were broken, grandparents disappeared, I was asked to become a giant, and I was taught my imagination was nothing but a fool, and I was playing with nothing but broken windows like they were some sort of ancient puzzle. Jagged edges, reflections of light, shards of stained glass. It's the little things in life that matter. So now, as a poet, I throw tiny pebbles onto pages and play hopscotch with memories, hoping that the right ones will stick. Have you ever done that? Decided on which memories to keep so that in the future you could be more happy with your past. I remember being told that each drop of water that we sip has passed through every single human that has ever lived, that has ever taken breath. Our bodies are mostly droplets of ancient history, currents of calamity, tsunamis of circumstance, springs of inspiration. The pharaohs of Egypt used to say, El yashrab min mayatil nil, lesem yiragala hateni. Whoever drinks from the Nile will always return. So as I grow, I hope this river inside me cleans me like ashes to the wind, smoke billowing through my canopy, sand along my brim, jagged edges, shards of stained glass. My mother remembers that at 1 year old, she caught me singing to myself, humming to myself in my playpen, with my fingertips dipped into my own used nappy. I was painting my first ever masterpiece. She tells me that I must be an artist at heart. So when my love did finally come to me, that night in our bed a forest grew and grew until our ceiling hung with vines and the walls became the world all around, and our hearts sailed back over a year, in and out of weeks and through a day, until finally we could look those monsters right into their yellow eyes and say, be still. And it would work. With not so many jagged edges, just reflecting our own hearts. She smelt like the crushing of crystals on the rocks of self-love, clear but thickening the wind. L'amore è come la luna, she would say. Quando non cresce, cala. Love is like the moon. It is only ever either growing stronger or fading away. So she set off into the forest, where 50 bedtime story-high buildings cast shadows all over her naked body. She set off into the forest, where the filament in her heart glowed brighter with each step she took from our edge. She set off into the forest, where one man's outback is another woman's in front, where one woman's wilderness is another man's home. So she never really spoke to me. She only heard me in her dreams and talked to me in light while I licked her filament clean. I was hoping to be a natural man, a tree trunk, or a wave. A spider on her web encased with the geometry of her frame. But instead, have you ever done that? Decided on which memories to keep so that in the future, I remember my parents once told me a story and bought me a kaleidoscope So now I listen to the words of the fool and gather the lost pieces to my puzzle. Now each cut on my skin is seen as a beam of light. Now the shards of glass are kept for their own memories, and bad memories are kept for my own self-reflections. And now I see that I'm a Rubik's Cube or a mosaic. I see I'm a geometric pattern or a labyrinth. I've learned that I am a cathedral, not a broken window. No matter how many jagged edges or shards of broken glass, now I still see my parents as the perfectly inverted universes they are, without needing to look through anything but the kaleidoscopic fragments of my own life. We are all tsunamis of circumstance, fragments of fortune, no matter how many jagged edges or shards of broken glass. Men are asked to become giants, but where the wild things are, we come in all shapes and sizes.
At the age of 19, I finally left home and moved into a share house. It was a type of place I'd spent a lot of time imagining as my radical young thing birthright, the opposite of everything I'd grown up with. Instead of a small, neat brick veneer in the suburbs, this was a grimy, old two-storey terrace in grimy inner-city Sydney. The kind of place where things might happen, revolutionary things. My mother was devastated when I left, but I dismissed her grief as a small price that had to be paid by her so that I could enter a world where people appreciated the culinary versatility of tofu and the perils of plastic bags, and where I would never have to drink instant coffee again or be subjected to conversations about the dangers of Asian immigration. In my new bedroom, one of my housemates had painted a mural, an enormous scene from Where the Wild Things Are. It was a canny reproduction of the famous double-page spread, the culmination of the wild rumpus, with the boy riding on the back of the monsters, roaring his terrible roar and gnashing his terrible teeth, his face glowing with ecstasy and rage and power, holding his kingly mace high in the air, rumpusing about. I proudly positioned my bed right under that mural. It felt to me like I was now part of that story, living in this house, or rather social experiment, that I now called home, shared at last with people who understood me. The longest-serving resident of my new house was Stu, who had a fondness for sarongs and would wear them whenever he didn't have to leave home. I secretly feared Stu's sarong days, when his tackle would constantly threaten to swing out, and would try to carry on conversations about the shopping and whose turn it was to cook as he casually tucked his low-dangling fellas back behind their flimsy cotton screen. In the room below me was Sarah, a deeply committed vegan who once cried when she found a carton of cow's milk in the fridge. Her passion impressed me enormously until one night I caught her eating a kebab outside the pub we'd been drinking in. Her guilty face smeared with garlic sauce and lamb juice. And of course, there was Starlight Amethyst, although the long worried messages her parents left on our answering machine were always addressed to a person called Michelle. Starlight was the artist behind the Sendak mural that adorned my bedroom wall, an art student whose preferred medium was menstrual blood and chicken wire. I was less charmed by our non-rent paying housemates, huge brown water rats that came up from the drain in the laneway behind our house. Unlike the rest of us who originally hailed from the burbs, these were big city rats, wise and cunning. When we naively tried to protect our lentils and our oats by putting them in jars, the rats just climbed onto the shelves and pushed the jars off, shattering them and helping themselves, as I lay in bed with a pillow over my head, trying to shut out the noise, lying back and thinking of the forthcoming revolution. Although we were a vegetarian household, there always seemed to be a meaty smell mixed in with any cooked dinner. At first, I thought it was a welcome olfactory hallucination until we discovered a hole in the back of the oven where a junior member of the local rat chapter had died, unnoticed and slowly crisped. After that, we started putting these huge rat traps in the oven at night, and in the morning, when you open the oven door, there'd always be an oversized rodent staring up at you, its neck snapped, its dead eyes bulging, accusing. It seemed to say, "If meat is murder, what do you call this, hippie?" Admittedly, the house was nothing more or less than a pit of filth. But what did domestic hygiene matter to the likes of us? We were focused on bigger things, shedding the trappings of bourgeois conservatism. Changing your sheets and cleaning up after yourself was part of the problem, not the solution. The truth is, as the weeks passed in that house, I came to hate my Sendak mural with a passion almost as much as I hated Stu's free-flowing gonads. I couldn't tell my mum or my housemates, but I have never been so desperately sad and homesick and lonely as I was in that house, because it's there that I finally realised that growing up really means being alone. I had imagined becoming an adult would be as simple as turning my back on my childhood, taking an angry leap and never looking back except to spit on the world that I'd come from. And I'd assumed that moving into a house like this would be the perfect way to achieve that. A fortress against all the things I'd left behind, things that my youthful posturing made me think I should be embarrassed about. The neatly pressed school uniforms and the clean sheets, my imperfect family, the dinners that might have been overboiled but were always there and never ever reeked of rat. And my mother, who I knew would be waiting up for me when I came home late, pretending that she was still asleep. And here I was, stuck with Stu and Starlight, nee Michelle, and the rats. And Sendak's boy, up on my wall rumpusing. But unlike the rest of us, he goes home at the end of his adventure and there's a hot bowl of soup waiting. If I could paint a mural for my young self, it wouldn't be a picture of wild things. It would be something from J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, the bit where Peter tells Wendy about his mother and about how many years before he'd flown out the nursery window looking for adventure, abandoning his home without a thought. And so he'd found Neverland and didn't think to go home for ever so long, although he always assumed that he could. And then one day he did go home to see his mother, but he couldn't get back in. You see, the nursery window had been locked, so his home was gone and only Neverland remained. Exciting maybe, but also scary and wild and lonely.
The journey can start from anywhere, but my people have a way station close by where we can gather our strength for the last push. We don't sail as they do in the story. We walk on pink carpet and parquet down measureless corridors until the carpet turns green and leads to a door only we know is there. It's a door like any other door. Strangers pass it all day, not knowing, not having a clue what lies on the other side. We like that. It is our door, and it keeps our secret because it is thick and fits so snugly. Not a sound escapes. There's no trick to the door. You just open it like any other door and step inside and look down into the pit. And if you're late, and I'm often a little late, they will already be roaring there. I am in the press gallery of the House of Representatives. This is question time, and the politicians below are roaring their terrible roars and gnashing their terrible teeth and rolling their terrible eyes and showing their terrible claws. There's Bob from Queensland, naked without his 10-gallon hat. There's Kevin hunched over his phone, checking his numbers. There's Sophie, Sophie, one of my favourites, all harumph and scorn as though she's just had a nasty tiff with Cook. And there's Joe collapsing these days inside his suit. But where's Peter? Not there, off perhaps on another trip through the vineyards, but Craig is there. Craig is there, lonely in his corner of empty green benches. And the noise all through this is terrible. Shouting, booing, catcalls, and bursts of operatic laughter. There's Julia in her new glasses and new clothes with new lines about modern families in the modern Australia her party will pretend to represent in 2013. And there is Tony, whose living skull costs him the woman's vote but won't cost him the election. And through the din, the speaker is yelling for order and quiet. Nothing I have heard in the world is like the sound of those men and women who roar for an hour by the clock every sitting day of the year in the House of Representatives. It's not like a football crowd roaring from the heart. It's too mean. It's not the noise W.H. Auden remembered in his mighty eulogy for Yeats, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the bourse. And it's not the row we all remember from the playground. True, this lot may have exercised their lungs for the first time when fights broke out on the Oval at recess, but they are not 16 any longer. Though I pause to observe that Kevin Andrews has the deep, dark, crow-black hair of a 16-year-old, and I don't know how he does it. No. The sound of Parliament raging is unique. It is sui generis pandemonium, and it is not an accident. The place is built for it, tuned for it. I wonder which politicians sat with the architects back in Malcolm Fraser's time to make sure the new House of Representatives chamber would sound just right. Not too loud, and heaven forbid, not too soft, and best for baritones. And quite by chance, as I think that thought, Bronnie sails towards the dispatch box, clutching her copy of standing orders, bristling with post-it notes. What a sight. The hair, the heels, the smile, the pearls, the jacket. What colour is the jacket? One of my colleagues on the press bench mutters. I suggest desert ochre, but a lad from Sky News says pumpkin, and into the notebooks all along the line is written by old hands like Michelle Grattan in Pittman's script, pumpkin. And down below, her face angled to catch the light. Bronnie is pitching another hopeless point of order to the speaker with such poise, such timing, such conviction. I have seen leagues clubs in the suburbs erupt with pleasure when Bronnie walks onto the stage. I have seen hard-bitten hacks of deep left conviction soften in her presence. I know of no one in public life who so compels attention when she has absolutely nothing to say. But the June Bronhill of the Northern Beaches gives the game away because she's so damn happy in her work. And that is the secret that Maurice Sendak understands. His monsters have no regrets. They don't want to be anything else, and they are happy where they are. They beg young Max to stay with them and play. But when he goes, do they go with him? Oh, no. They are happy there. That's Sendak's tough message for the likes of us who despair of politics. They are not going to change. They won't reform. It's no use offering Sophie ideas or reproaching Christopher Pyne. Wayne is never going to explain himself. And Tony will not be prime ministerial until he is prime minister. We have to face it. This is what they want to be and where they want to be, living in a popular children's story, roaring and gnashing and rolling their eyes and flashing their claws in the land where the wild things are.
Good evening. I assume that I have been invited here tonight because of my reputation for having spent quite a lot of time out where the wild things are. And I know I risk being forever stuck with the camel lady by referring back to her, even though from my point of view, she's just an atoll in the vast sea of my experience. But I will accept the typecasting in order to reflect on the fact that wild things in both the animal and human realms risk extinction. I'll start with the animals. When I was a girl, bandicoots dug up our lawn, wallabies slammed into our fences, emus raced beside our car, blue-tongued lizards, red-bellied black snakes, and dear old pythons shared my cubby house and the shearing shed. And years later, when I walked across Australia, the Central Desert still felt, by and large, healthy and productive. There was plenty of bush tucker. The desert surface was delicately laced with the tracks of native marsupials and insects and reptiles. Of course, rabbits, cattle and sheep had already transformed that landscape, but particularly out in the free country, away from grazing areas, the desert was a remarkably fecund place if you understood it. It's true that the role of extinctions had been gathering momentum since settler days, but I don't think anyone could have imagined that one day the rate of extinction would lead someone to describe our era as the age of solitude. These days, the desert is covered by the tracks of camels, foxes and cats, and by the ubiquitous buffel grass introduced from Africa, which is suffocating native grasses and herbage, and the small animals who once found shelter there. We know that Aboriginal people, once regarded as the very exemplars of wild things, both compliment and derogation all at once, are, with notable exceptions, in a pretty bad way. As one old Aboriginal bloke said to me last time I visited, "What is to become of us? Will we all wither and die underneath this whitefella grass and become yet another lost species?" Then there is the wildness of the sorts of people who cross deserts. The question I'm most commonly asked is why? And a more pertinent question might be, why is it that more people don't attempt to escape the restrictions and conventions imposed upon them? If Tracks has a message at all, it is that one can be awake to the demand for obedience that seems natural simply because it is familiar. Of course, I did not mean that people should drop what they were doing and head for the wilder places. I meant that one can choose adventure in the most ordinary of circumstances. Adventure of the mind, or to use an old-fashioned word, the spirit. Perhaps it was easier back in the 70s for young people to challenge the status quo. We were lucky to have experienced only post-war prosperity, so we were not obsessed by financial security. We were afraid for our future in other ways, nuclear bombs, the Cold War and its various hotspots. So politics was in the air you breathed. And politics was about justice. It was high-minded and nothing to do with the low-life power struggles of career politicians. We reacted against the closing in of the post-war nuclear family, in particular its assumption that women should remain inside the domestic realm or be little more than sexual objects. We wanted to understand the political forces that shaped society, the injustices that allowed us material well-being while most of humanity starved. But perhaps most importantly, nothing was as necessary as freedom. The freedom to make an individual of yourself, and such aspirations invariably involved risk. Such a journey as I made would be impossible now. There would be many, many more people out there with many more ways of keeping track of you, more red tape to hold you back, more fences, more signs telling you how to behave, where you must and must not go, signs telling you to be careful, to be safe, to be aware of danger. New communications technology would make it impossible to get lost no matter how hard you tried. Modern states legislate against wildness because wild things tend to think for themselves and therefore to ask annoying questions. And they tend not to participate fully in the conspicuous consumption of unnecessary crap. Wild things are necessarily free things. But what can freedom mean in an increasingly bureaucratized world where the possibilities to act are so minute? We are so comfortable here in Australia, so protected from the darker realities of the world, and we pride ourselves on being free. But really, all we choose is between 2 or 3 kinds of sameness. It is almost impossible to choose to live outside of the gargantuan administration which is modern life. The freedom to choose, to be wild, has diminished to the freedom to purchase, to be safe, to live in a zoo. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And a small cheers to all of the volunteers and incredible people who made tonight possible, ladies and gentlemen. Now, as Robin mentioned, is it any wonder that those few of us who can would choose to live safe lives? It seems to me that that is, of course, the most obvious way to live a long life and ensure that your genetic profile is paid forward. And yet, what do we know about safety and evolution? It is those few amongst us, the lovers, the crazy people, the writers, the authors, the agitators. These are the ones who truly move our evolution forward. And yet, how do we find the courage to embrace the artistry that is within us just by virtue of the very fact of having been born? It's a question many of us struggle with, and this next song speaks to it. It is not, as many of you have hoped, the song Wild Thing. As a small point of notice, the song Wild Thing, I was just recently informed on Twitter by Ross Wilson, was written by the uncle of Angelina Jolie. There are so many facts of that nature that we could spend this Saturday night mulling through. But instead, I want to remind you of something that you already know, and it's a question and an answer within itself. That a great leap forward, that going where the wild things are, is in fact a small thing indeed. You want to write a novel, make beautiful music, act in the theatre with inspiring humans, learn a language and run like the wind, help people fit in, travel to every country, make $1 million and smile when your children have babies, make the heart your home, inviting and warm. You want this amazing life, but you can't decide. You think you have to be fully formed already, don't you? You want this amazing life, but you can't decide. You don't have to be just one thing, but you have to start with something. You'll be a little bit older in October. You've reneged on your pre-birth promise. Now you think that this journey is over. Let me encourage you to know you will feel it when it is over. If it just feels like hell, take it as a sign you need time to be still and listen for a while. You want this amazing life, but you can't decide. You think you have to be fully formed already, don't you? You want this amazing life, but you can't decide. You don't have to be just one thing, but you have to start with something. You don't have to be just one thing, but you have to start with something. You do not have to be just one thing, but you have to start with one wild thing. Thank you.